Good evening, everyone. My name is Reggie Abraham, and I'm with Fair Count, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization which focuses on increasing civic and voter participation across the state of Georgia. We hope you and your families are safe and healthy during this time. And we want to thank you for joining us this evening. Black Men Count, in partnership with the Delta Delta and Gamma Omicron Lambda chapters of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, are hosting tonight's conversation about the importance of Black men voting in our local elections and the impact these elections have on our everyday lives. Before we begin the conversation, we would like to remind everyone that Fair Count is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and as such, does not advocate for the defeat, election, or reelection of any person from any political party. We have an exciting panel of brothers from across the state who are joining us tonight for this conversation. Again, our conversation is with Black men, just about Black men. We will pose topic questions for discussion and let each of our guests weigh in as they see fit. Before we begin, we'd like to first introduce our special guests who've joined us tonight. With us tonight, we have Teddy Reese, who is owner and managing attorney of the Reese Firm, LLC in Columbus. Mr. Reese, Teddy, would you like to say hello to our guest tonight?
Well, hello, everyone, and I want to say thank you to you, Reggie, and Fair Count for holding this important conversation. As you see, I'm in one of the local cigar bars here in Columbus, and I got some gentlemen from the community that are here with me in attendance who will be watching this on a big screen as it plays out here within the panel discussion. So we're very excited about the conversation, and certainly an honor to be on with such distinguished gentlemen as Mr. Brown and Mr. Page. So thank you so much for having me, sir.
Thank you so much. Our second guest for the evening is Javon Page. He is a motivational speaker with his own, organization, Stay Jotivated, LLC, and he serves as the development and communication specialist at the Ron Clark Academy here in Atlanta. Mr. Page, Javon, would you like to say hello to everyone this evening?
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity too. I feel honored to be even on this call in the first place. I think that this is a very important and impactful conversation that needs to be had. And it's one of those that needs to be recurring as well. So it can't stop and start here. We have to continue. So I'm honored to be here and can't wait to get into it.
Well, we're so glad to have you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And then our final guest is certainly no stranger to Fair Count. He's one of our own, our colleague, but also he serves in the capacity as being the mayor of Buena Vista, Georgia. Mayor Kevin Brown, would you like to say hello to our guest this evening?
Certainly, Reggie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be amongst these guests and to address the issues that we're going to address tonight. Definitely a pleasure, and I want to thank the brothers at Alpha Phi Alpha for partnering with Fair Count to make this event such a success. Part of my duties as mayor, and I really want to put this out because one of the things that I've had to do today is to form a search party for a missing young man in our community. And I want to take this opportunity to put his name out because if you know this young man, if you know of his whereabouts, we're asking at this time that you please reach out to the family of Mr. Jamarcus Bridges. You may have seen him on the local news, but we're really sending prayers and we're asking for assistance in finding this young brother. But tonight we're going to address some issues and I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks again, Reggie.
Thank you again, Mayor Brown, and definitely prayers up to Mr. Bridges' family and just the Buena Vista community. Hopeful for a safe return for him. Before we begin tonight's conversation, we want to pause for a second. We want to make sure for everyone who's listening, would you please right now at this point, please take out your phones, your cell phones that you have on you right now. If you are joining us via Zoom, we're going to present an actual page that shows an actual QR code that you would be able to scan. And on that QR code, the one that you see right now on your screen, if you would please scan that, we would like for you to be able to please complete the commit to vote card that is on your screen right now. So please, if you have not already, please take out your phones and please make the time to actually scan that QR code and complete that commit to vote card. It's highly important that we get as many people completing commit to vote cards as possible for the season that's coming up. So if you would, please, we're going to give everyone just a few seconds to be able to just send and click on so that you can be able to make that commitment. For those of you, just continue to move on with everything. For those of you who either are just now joining us, or if you're listening in, please be sure to visit us at vote-365.org to complete the commit to vote card. So that way you'll be able to click on and complete it yourselves at your leisure. But thank you all so very much for taking the time to be able to click that card. We want to make sure for everyone who is committing to vote in the upcoming elections, you can stay informed, certainly about what Black Men Count is doing with our next events, but also what Fair Count overall is doing. So thank you all so much for making the time and making that commitment. So with that being done, let's jump right into tonight's conversation, shall we? So, though a number of Black men are registered and we vote in elections, when it comes to reaching out to Black men who normally do not vote or may not be registered to vote, the first words out of our mouths cannot always be or may not always need to be about voting. Teddy, if you won't mind kicking us off with the conversation with this first question, when it comes to talking with Black men about the importance of voting, especially in local elections, how should we approach the conversation to meet brothers exactly where they are?
Well, Reggie, that's a very, very great question. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you kick the question off. Too often we put emphasis on just voting in general versus having a greater conversation about what happens when we vote, the impact of a good vote, of a solid vote, how leadership is dependent upon that, how dollars that may funnel through your community is impacted by how you vote. Sometimes as simple as who controls city council, what group of interest controls city council, and how you can move things within that budget to benefit your community. You're looking for those recreational centers? Well, get you some council members that will put those in place for our children in our community so that they don't become victims to drugs and violence and gangs and things of that nature. You're concerned about your kids being able to have adequate space to walk to school, then maybe you need to look at that school board race or that city council race and say, hey, what are we doing in regards to safety for our children? So I think one thing that we fail to do as a society sometimes is really get down to the nitty gritty with Black men about why it's so important for us to vote. You know, we're having the conversation about the sacrifice of the vote. We've talked about Selma. Many of us have made that pilgrimage to Selma and walked across that same bridge. And we've seen the Trail of Tears and we've seen that path from Selma to Montgomery and thinking about the historic leaders that came before us. But now you have to look at it in today's relevance. What does that vote mean in 2022? How is that vote important to an individual? How can you make that vote important to an individual? We got to get back to the basics of reaching our voters where they are, versus expecting our voters to fit into these cute little cups that we've designed that say, oh, we got an interest group here and an interest group there, and where do you fit in? No, what are your interests? And let's talk about how we can work collectively to get those done. Because no matter if you're Black or white or brown or male or female, once we all get to talking, we can find common ground and common interests. And those are the things we should look to work on first. I called it the low-hanging fruit within the political world.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Teddy, for that answer. I want to bring in both Javon and Kevin, if you all wanted to elaborate more on just when it comes to the importance of talking about voting with Black men, especially on the local level, how should we approach that conversation with brothers to make sure we meet them where they are?
Some things we really have to make personal, like Teddy was saying, that we really have to show them how it's going to benefit them. I know in my really small community, there's a There's a desire to have recreation centers and basketball courts and those type things. But unfortunately, the brothers who is going to benefit, they don't vote. So I really have to really press them and show them how it's going to benefit them. And we have to make it personal. I can remember as a young man growing up in this rural community, watching majority of the things that would happen as far as infrastructure and resources were going to one side of the track. And that's because those who were on city council, on the school board, and on county commission, they didn't look like me, or they didn't desire the same things that I desire. So unfortunately, my side of the world went without. So I realized early on from my parents that we have to be very mindful, and we have to press to be included on city councils and county commissions so we can make those decisions that's going to have a direct impact on our own communities.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Kevin. Javon, I wanted to get you in on this, but I have a question and want to circle back with you about to just get your thoughts on. Javon, obviously, even in your title, you've worked in the civic engagement and voting education space, particularly with younger Black men. Teddy and Kevin have definitely kicked us off, but one question I'd like to be able to have you kick us off with insofar as the next topic is, what would you say are some of the most effective ways to engage both millennial and Gen Z generation Black men or Black boys? And what do you believe could be key in getting them to pay attention to voting in local elections?
Yeah, I appreciate that, alley-oop, Reggie, because ironically, I was going to take that angle in the previous conversation. I think that Teddy made a wonderful point. Kevin made a great point as well in terms of relevance, but I just want to take a different angle answering the same sort of question. Essentially, I think one of the things that's paramount in having conversations with millennial and young adults about voting, especially men, is identifying the fact that their why might not necessarily align with what yours is. And one thing that Teddy said, which for me resonates because I was raised with my grandparents. So, I've always had I've always kind of been connected and understood what our predecessors did for us, the sacrifices that they had to make for us to have the liberties that we do, albeit not all the liberties that we deserve, but everyone doesn't connect with that. And unfortunately, it can be very frustrating, especially for someone who understands the value of the historical context of how much we went through, when you're having conversations with young men who will essentially say, I don't care what my grandparents went through. That doesn't have anything to do with me. I never met my grandfather or my grandmother, or it doesn't really mean much to me that people were dying for the right to vote because I don't really want to. What I've been able to see is that a great segue to bridging that gap initially is to first be able to answer for yourself why you vote, and to try to find different reasons of why that is, aside from the fact that you should because your ancestors did so. And if you can meet them with logic and be able to hear them and listen, what I've been able to see in my civic engagement related to those spaces, it's been really effective for me to be able to say, hey, this is why I vote. This is why it's important. I'm going to acknowledge everything you're going to say about a system that can be broken. But what I'm also going to let you know is that if a system is broken, it doesn't mean that you don't find out how to play the game. And I think what's the most important thing in this context is to allow them to understand that the reasons why a lot of these things aren't working is because we don't have enough pieces on the board in the right areas in order for it to work in the first place. And I think that we try to skip too many steps and get to the empowerment piece. We get to a point to where we know elections is important, especially I love the fact that we're going to be talking about the importance of local elections because no one even sees that scope. I think one thing that was really frustrating for me, and at the time I was 24, 25 years old, is when we were making cold calls for people to vote for who they wanted to vote for governor. A lot of people didn't know that there was a difference between the mayor and the gubernatorial race, and these are adults. So part of it is education, but another part of it, just like Teddy said, is meeting these people where they are. And Kevin said the same thing. You have to meet people where they are in order to get the best results from young people.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. You said so much in that part. Kevin and Teddy, I know you were kind of talking about a little bit about that, but also want to bring you all in on your thoughts about just reaching out to both millennial and Gen Z generation Black men.
I'm sorry about that. What I was saying is, I think to Javon's point, there are many individuals within that current structure that you were just talking about, that age group, that are trying to find their place in our current political world, if you will. And oftentimes it's just like when we're fighting for diversity on the bench and we're saying we want judges that look like us, or we want representation that looks like us. That age group want representation that looks like them. Exactly. They feel like they can relate to them. They feel like they can connect with them. And what we have seen, especially through the Obama years, is that when you engage that particular age group, they come out and they vote. If you could write a coherent Facebook post when Nipsey Hussle died, then you are certainly tagged into that age group. If you didn't know who that was, you're missing a large part of your constituency. And it's about outreach. It's about the work that needs to be done by elected officials. They really drive this engine. I'm not saying you gotta be young, but if you can tap into that group, if you can meet them where they are, if you can go have that cigar with them, if you can attend one of those concerts, or hey, go spend a Friday night at the club with them, meeting the voters where they are, you have to show that interest, and they will show the exact same interest. We talk about generations being dismissive, but you know what? One thing I notice is we have had those narratives just about for every generation that has existed. The one before them have said, oh, these folks are crazy. They are wild. They talk about our music, but then we listen to folks like, Betty Wright talking about, stuff like As We Lay and things of that nature. If you read the lyrics, it's really the same thing. So every generation has gone, Reggie, through that stage of telling the next one that you're off base. You're going to be the doom of who we are. And here we are. We're still existing, and we're still growing, and we're still maturing. And the thing is, you have to embrace that change. So I think that generation want us to understand them by embracing the change, thinking outside the box, going with the flow sometimes, and just listening to their viewpoints. I mean, if you look at it nationally, look at all the young people that are really pushing the conversation of doing something with student loan debt. Right. Look at that conversation. That's what's driving that generational group right now. That's going to be a hot topic voting point for them moving forward. Are we listening? Are we listening at the state level? Are we listening in Washington, D.C.? Are we listening in our local town city halls and on Main Street, Mayor Brown? Are we listening out there at the square at Buena Vista? And so those are the conversations that are important, I think, Reggie. And we got to be able to embrace the change.
You bring up a very good point. And Kevin, I want to go to you in just a moment, but
sure.
You were just talking about that, and this is certainly to everybody. You bring up a great point about listening. And all of you in some way so far have already talked about kind of like what a little bit about what needs to be said, but I wanted to pose this question back to you all directly. You've kind of said it a little bit, especially just now, Ted, we were talking about like, if you can write a Facebook post on Nipsey Hussle, like those types of things, saying to Black men to help, what should we be saying to Black men to help us understand? And by us, not just Black men, but everybody who kind of works in the civic engagement space. What should we be saying to help us understand how important both the voices of Black men and the votes of Black men are, particularly in local elections? And you begin to talk about that, but I want to expand that out a little bit now that we have that. So Ted, if you'd like to circle back or expound a little bit more, but we can kick it.
I don't know if it's what we should be saying. I think we should walk into the room ready to listen. That's another problem with the younger generation, because sometimes the older and the wiser walks into the room and they're ready to do all the talking and expect everyone else to listen. One thing my 88-year-old grandmother always taught me is that respect is a two-way street. She was a hard-working woman who worked 35 years for the state of Georgia, cleaning floors and beds and toilets for disabled veterans and people with disabilities at Central State Hospital in Millersville. She didn't finish high school, but she was a woman of wisdom. She was one who knew how to reach the younger people in our community because she kept a piece of sausage and a biscuit on the stove for any child that came hungry. And she would sit there and they would talk to her all day. And everyone called her Miss Carrie Lou. And guess what? She had not one problem, Reggie, out of any of the young folks. on her block because she created the community herself. She was the foundation of the community. She listened to them. And that's why listening is so important. That's the foundation. If we listen to each generation, we will know what they need. We will know what they want. We will know their desires. We will know what's the foundation of some of the problems that they see within their community. No one wants to live in a community riddled in violence and drugs and houses with boarded up windows and prostitution. They will tell you what the problem is if we listen, but we can't ignore them because that generation is very quick. Once they think that you are not paying attention or that you have brushed them to the side or you have minimized what they want to bring to the table, they will cut that connection. And the real question is, can you blame them?
Gotcha. Well said. Thank you for that. Kevin or Joe, y'all want to weigh in a little bit more?
Yeah.
I'll just quickly say, as a 54-year-old man, I learned and listened well. I realized that I had become my dad because I started telling young folks, listen to what I'm saying, rather than opening my ears and listening to what they were saying. And somehow we have developed a gap between our age groups. And one of the things that I'm doing right now is that I realize that I, as a 54-year-old man, I really can't have that connection right off the bat with a 20-year-old. So I have to empower and develop a team of young folks who can go in and make that connection for me. And then we can have that conversation. But I love that we must listen to what they're saying.
So I'd agree, but I'd also push back. Adversely, it's important to be able to have conversations, especially when a lot of the people who we want to listen to don't know what to say or don't even see the value in saying something. I think that symbolically, there's been a mute button that's been essentially perpetuated generations of Black men to not really be able to speak on emotions and to not really be able to expound on your feelings and to not really be able to be in a space to where you're in the right positions. I've come up with this analogy. The 3 Ps are passion, position, purpose. And typically when we're talking about politics, we have passion and we have purpose, but we're not understanding the position. So there's a key to that conversation, but the person in that seat to have that conversation has to look different. So as Kevin alluded to, as Teddy alluded to, you need to be having someone to be able to educate, then elevate, then activate. But you can't do it without educating first. And you can't educate a person for them to listen without someone that they want to listen to. So we already kind of talked about it. You want to position people who are younger, who understand, to be in those positions to have those conversations, because if I have to ask you a question about why it's important to vote in local elections and you don't even understand that the local election is the single most powerful and paramount sort of branch that you can even activate from a gubernatorial, from a governor level, like your local election is going to influence you the most. But all they see is president, not understanding that the president doesn't even have autonomy in your own particular state. So we can't even have those conversations and expect to listen from those people if we haven't educated them. And I mean, it's something I'm even learning in continuing education spaces. So before I started working at the middle school I'm working at now, I was working at a college. And I've sat in African-American studies class, and a lot of those people for the first time were educated on the fact that the 3 branches of government that you're taught aren't the only parts to the government. That you learn legislative, you learn judicial, you learn executive, but you only look at it from a United States of America perspective, but don't really understand all the nuance that goes with a chief of staff of police. You don't really understand what a DA is. And all those people are being educated after we already have to pick up the pieces from someone being shot. Now you see it on CNN, and now you see people talking about it on Facebook posts, and you try to educate yourself on the internet and then be able to speak from a perspective that isn't all the way macro. So it takes, in my opinion, of course, listening is extremely important, but when we listen, and then I feel like a lot of the feedback we'll have in those conversations when we listen is just, yo, I don't know. So why is everybody yelling at me and telling me what I need to be doing? I don't know. I wasn't told this. I didn't learn this in middle school. You know, when you're learning Georgia studies, they don't tell you how important it is for the person who's prosecuting people to be held accountable, because a lot of people don't even know those are elected officials. So I think the conversation needs to be about not just year round, but political cycle Like we have to do this from the beginning. We can't wait till it's an election year. And I feel like we constantly say these things and we have these conversations 2, 3, 4 years outside of the elections, and then we forget or we get distracted, or we just say, oh, we got another day, and then we aren't having the conversations until September of a governor year. Well, we're going to be in the same spot. And then now, if we are being realistic, the way they're drawing party lines, we don't really have much time to be able to have these conversations to really empower people to understand what's going on. Like, I know plenty of people who are just living their lives like everything's okay, not realizing that when they say that they're carving up counties, that's to prevent your vote from mattering even more. But we have to be in a position to educate them at times when they don't immediately need to activate it, because it seems so transactional then. Because if I'm telling you how important it is to vote 2 months before, and then I'm trying to get your vote instead of being able to educate you when you're 16, when you're 17, before you vote, instead of trying to push you out of the polls right when you're in high school, it makes us no better than anybody else to just use them for a vote, but not necessarily teach them the things necessary for them to make their own decisions.
You know, Reggie, to Javon's point, I think it's more like the chicken and egg situation. Which one came first? You know, we really don't know. Because my thing is, how can you educate me on something that you don't know I'm deficient in? If you come talking to me trying to educate me on something that I already know, then you're going to lose my attention real quick. That's why I think that a lot of our political conversations need to get back to the local level. We need to empower people within our counties and municipalities, again, who has the knowledge and the know-how of what's going on the ground locally, of what they people need to know. And that comes from some type of microcosm of listening, of understanding, whether it's actively listening to a conversation or whether you're listening to what they need as a combination of your acquired knowledge, because you have been transgressing that community and you know what's lacking. Listening, not, you know, there's different ways to obtain knowledge of what people may need and how they may need to be interacted with. It's not necessarily about the verbal conversation. If you're driving through a community and you see there's constantly trash on the side of the road, do you need the lady who lived there to tell you she would like her street cleaned up? No, because you can observe that. And that's where that local engagement comes back in. And I think that's why it's important. So, you know, to Javon's point, and Javon, I'm not minimizing your point. I guess what I'm saying is I can see how in certain environments, in certain locations, in certain locales, in certain communities, how you may need to educate first, and sometimes you may need to listen first. That's where that understanding of comes from, of that local engagement. And Kevin, you know, you guys did a lot with that here in the West Central Georgia area with Fair Count. You know, you and I participated in a discussion, barbershop talk, where, you know, we had 8 barbers and 8 guys from the community, and we had the barbers to invite the same guys who had cut that day and the day before to come back and have the conversation with us. And they did. They came back and we learned so much. So we have to engage. You can't assume someone's intelligence level, and you don't want to make that assumption because you don't want to offend anyone either. So, you know, the easiest way to go into the conversation, from my opinion, would be to ask the basic questions first to make that assessment, to see where we are, and then we'll know what level in which we need to educate. But to Javon's point, there may be, you know, some high-end, high-dollar communities where, you know, that the probability of people being highly educated in this area is high. So therefore, at that moment there, you know, how much do I really need to educate you on? Maybe I just need to listen to what you're saying. So, you know, there's a lot of different options there that I think we need to explore with that. And just, it gets down to the basic of understanding your community, understanding your local community.
Definitely.
I think,
and it also hits on the ability.
Can I interject quickly?
Go ahead, sure, go ahead.
It's going to be really.
I'm listening.
Yeah. I think that Teddy kind of agreed with me, because essentially what I was saying is the education needs to be coming from a person who the community understands, who looks like the people in the demographic that you're trying to reach. So specifically, the question was about millennials, Gen Z, young adults. What I was saying is passion, position, purpose. The person positioned to have the conversation should be able to talk to the things that understand that the people in that age bracket. And I'm telling you, as a person who was the director of youth, millennial, college engagement, that a lot of those people don't have the understanding of those conversations. Now, what you mentioned is, and what I can tell you, that's a generational thing that probably started with millennials and just has gotten even worse with Gen Z, is the inability to really want to do something unless there's some sort of incentive attached to it. What we had to do is, in order for people to come learn about Stacey Abrams, no matter how great she was, no matter how many commercials she was, if we wanted young people to know, we had to say, hey, we're having an open bar event. Come on out. And they would come on out to the open bar event, and then we would have conversations about the things that were important to them, similar to what you were saying about student loans. Like, those things are important. Now, from an education piece, as you're saying, it doesn't mean you're getting up lecturing people, telling them, hey, you don't know this, and now you need to know. It's the same thing as if you're sitting at the barbershop, because that's an educational conversation, because you're being able to listen and have that conversation at the same time and educate people on the value of having those things. So I don't think that we necessarily were disagreeing at all. I just was saying that the person who's having the conversation needs to be a person that they want to receive it from.
And I think we're all saying the same thing. I know, Reggie, you need to move on, but I think we're saying the same thing. We're just trying to employ the best and most effective way of opening up communication. And oftentimes, older heads will come into a community and we are boasting about the things that we know, and we fail to listen to the younger people. And it puts a block up, and therefore the communication piece ultimately fails. So I think one of my approaches now, again, is going into a community. If I'm going to ask a younger person to vote, first I'm going to go in and I'm going to find someone who can perceive me first. But then I'm going to open up that line of communication to hear what they need in that community. And once they share that need, now I can share some things from my perspective and my experience about the best way to make those things happen. But we have to open up those lines of communication.
You bring up a very good point, and thank you both to Javon, Teddy, and you as well, Kevin. We love here at Black Men Count to be able to hear all of these ideas and all of these parts, because everyone listening can relate to all, some, or even parts of what's being discussed. So absolutely love that part. Kevin, to circle back to you though, you, sir, sitting in a position of being an elected official, obviously have seen and actually experienced how to get registered voters off of their couch and out to the polls. But many people don't understand, like how we talked about tonight, how much local elected officials make decisions that impact their everyday life. You were beginning to talk a little bit about it, Kevin, but would you kick us off and just talk and explore a little bit more about some of the decisions local electeds make that affect the course of everyday lives? And would you please talk to us a little bit about in what ways you believe Black men can help influence those decisions to help better our communities? We already spoke about just needing, first and foremost, people who look like us in those positions and people who can relate to us, which is a great start, but wanted to continue that conversation, if you would, Kevin.
Sure. A lot of times when you approach some brothers about voting, first thing they'll say is, well, I don't want to get involved in politics. But one thing we must realize is politics is a process which determines who gets what, when, and how. And ultimately, it comes down to money and funding, about how that money is going to be funded, spent in a city, where is it going to be spent, and who is it going to be spent on. For instance, again, going back to my early years and growing up in a small community, I would see where roads were not being repaired on my side of the community. As it relates to school board, I would see where books were being purchased in another school but not being purchased in my school. Number of resources, it all goes back to resources. So as we look at being civically engaged as well, going even back to the census, because we were not involved in the census like we should have been, when it comes to funding that's coming down, like CARES Act funding and those type funds that are coming from the Fed or state down to a local level, it's going to depend on who's being counted, who's standing up. And unfortunately, a lot of times we're not being accounted for and we're not standing up. Therefore, those funds are bypassing us because, one, we don't have people in positions of power that's going to make sure it's going to come to us. Therefore, it's so very important that we get people involved in the process. And when I say process, I'm meaning from census to voting to redistricting to everything. We got to be involved in the process so that we can get our share of funding. A lot of young guys will say, well, I don't have property, So I'm not paying taxes. I said, well, every time you go in the store, you're spending 1 cent here or 1 cent there. That sales tax is being collected and sent somewhere, and eventually it's going to come back down to our local area. So we have to have people in position of power that's going to determine where those funds are going to be spent. And unfortunately, a lot of times we don't have those people in positions of power. So that's how I really try to make it relevant to younger people in our community, to show them how it directly impacts them on a local level. Because local politics, that's really the most important and direct impact on a person's life. So, yeah.
Definitely, 100%. And Kevin, you and I, and certainly some of our colleagues have talked about, and this is something that Jovan and Teddy were speaking about a little bit more as well, that people understanding, especially when Javon was mentioning about the DA position, with all of us and everything that we notice that is going on, a lot of people not understanding that when it comes to being able to have people who look like us on juries in a completely non-political, nonpartisan way, just somewhat of that representation as it comes to Black men, it may not always be realized that a number of different counties use voter registration to determine who is going to sit on which juries, or just to be able to have a jury pool. So could you speak a little bit more to that part that we've kind of discussed insofar as like some of those connections? And I'm certainly, Teddy and Javon, please jump in here as well. When it comes to those type of connections that Black men in our communities, Black boys, we're not always aware of when we see what's happening and we don't quite get why it's happening.
Again, our inability to be accounted and stand up and be accounted for in certain situations leaves us in a shortfall oftentimes as it relates to jurors. But even going back to my position as mayor, being a supervisor over law enforcement, a lot of times we take that for granted. We see majority of our Black men being picked up or being targeted. It's because they don't have people in position of power that can control or supervise the law enforcement world. So it's just so many direct impacts that a local election has on a community, that therefore we really have to push and get our people involved in the process.
Definitely, 100%. I know we want to be able to get to like one or two more questions, but Kevin or Javon, did y'all have anything that y'all want to weigh in here about?
No, well, you talked about voter registration and how that's, how we select our jury pool. Even state politics determine that. I attended law school in Florida at Florida A&M, and I clerked with the felony judge while serving on the Florida A&M law review. And they select their jury participants by driver license registration. Mm-hmm. Imagine how diverse our jury pools would be here in Georgia if we went based upon driver license versus voter registration. And then you think about those who don't even currently have the right to vote because of, their ties with the law or previous criminal activity, and not realizing that if you've done your time, if you served your probation, if you've paid all your fines and everything is clear, now in Georgia, the only thing you have to do is simply go register to vote again. A lot of people don't even understand things like that. So, we have a lot of informing that we need to do in our community, but it really goes back to some of the simple things that we discuss as it relates to voting and registering to vote, how it has a greater impact than just going in that booth on the first Tuesday after the second Monday in November to cast that vote. It's more important than that.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And I know this is an absolutely incredible conversation. Thank you all so very much for definitely weighing in and giving us just your thoughts about it. One question I wanted to go to, particularly because this is some of the work that Fair Count does. Insofar as like we work mostly in rural communities, both in middle and southern Georgia. And a lot of these areas, you all may be aware of, certainly Kevin and I and our colleagues know, they traditionally do not receive many resources or sometimes even just attention in some of the areas that we're talking about. So one of the questions I want to ask you all, just to pose to any of you all, and any of you all can just jump in and start it off. In what ways do you all feel the outreach certainly to people overall, but within this context to Black men? In what ways do you think that outreach in rural Georgia needs to be different, or could be different, or even an effective or more effective in rural Georgia than it could be in larger population centers throughout the state, given the fact that, of course, everyone may not have access to the same resources and the same people? What do you think would be effective outreach to Black men in rural Georgia in relationship to like larger population centers? And anyone can hop in just to discuss.
I love this mantra of a people power campaign. I think that's one of the things that was so enamoring when I first got involved in a political space, because similar to the conversation we were having previously, I didn't assume myself to be a political person. I didn't really want to have that conversation. I always educated myself on it. I was a public policy, political science major, but I'm not political. I don't get into any of that kind of stuff. So I never saw myself actually working on a campaign, because when I think about a politician, I think of the adjectives snark, I think about condescending, I think about liar, I think about those kind of things. We had the conversation. I heard Kevin talking about the responsibility of being a police chief, right? You can even talk about people who kind of spew rhetoric of defunding police, or let's just make it a more practical example. We have people who are running for office who say that they would relinquish student loans, but then they have amnesia once they kind of get into that position. Like, those are the kind of reasons why a lot of younger people don't want to vote in the first place. But when you look at from a macro perspective, I think there's so many. If we look at a microcosm of the African-American male vote, and if we're being 100% frank and transparent, I feel like we can do this on this call, it's even more of a microcosm to be in a political space, to be a heterosexual African-American male. So there's almost, if you're running for something, then there's an intimidation factor that comes from a Black man who's running for something. But then if you aren't, sometimes that voice kind of gets forgotten. Even when we think about the constituencies that are typically targeted in political elections, now there's typically women, because they're the larger voting base, of course, Black women as well. You have LGBT, and then there's this small pocket, but then there's an even smaller pocket of those individuals in rural Georgia who aren't on social media, who won't really be attending the phone banks or anything. And that's when the people power campaign mantra is most important. Is I think we get away from the traditionalism of certain things. And I think that's the problem with our generation sometimes, is we continue to find ways to innovate, but sometimes we try to fix things that aren't broken. And the most success that I was having is when I would knock on a door, have a conversation with someone, and instead of saying, hey, you need to vote for, or have you voted yet? The first thing I would say is, hey, how you doing? What's your name? It's an even exchange. I actually learned it in one of my business classes, that if I were to meet Kevin for the first time, and then I say, hey, what's your name? And then he tells me Kevin, well, we've already started at an unequal exchange, because he's given me something before I've given him anything. And those sorts of psychological experiences are things that we don't necessarily understand have a nuanced effect on why someone doesn't want to vote or isn't activated. But you're telling me to vote for somebody, but I don't even know your name. You just knocked on my door. So like, I just feel like one of the biggest ways to reach the rural areas, whether that's a younger or an older demographic, is to get in those trenches and have those conversations. But it also means that you want to have people who want to have those conversations. I think one of the most annoying thing is to have someone who goes to knock on the door, does this twice, and then walks away. Or the immediate time someone says, hey, yeah, I'm not into voting, instead of saying, you know, if you wouldn't mind me asking, is there anything that could change your mind? You just quit. And I feel like if we're getting granular and talking deeper about it, like that's some of the experiences that our little Black boys have, is that people quit on them. People think that they can't do it, or they write them off because, as Teddy was alluding to, they have a criminal record, or, you know, any of that kind of stuff. So I think, long story short, I think the most important thing is for us in certain areas, especially rural areas, to actually have those conversations door to door.
You know, Javon brings up some excellent points there, Reggie. If I can jump in at this moment right here, this is a topic of discussion that is directly dear to my heart. I was raised in rural Georgia, little nappy head, barefoot boy running around chasing my grandmother chickens in Wilkinson County. The county has never had more than 10,000 residents. Grew up in the little city of Gordon, Georgia, with roughly about 3,000 people. One thing I will say is that we didn't see much activity from the mainstream political parties, but we had our own internal political structures that was just as active. I was a sophomore, junior in high school, working on my cousin's campaign for probate judge and working on another cousin's campaign for sheriff, who is still the sheriff right now over in Wilkinson County. I think part of what I experienced growing up is that oftentimes small counties in Georgia, especially those that are going to show up a certain color on the map on election day, they get overlooked in the next cycle because people tend to look at a map and say, oh, there's nothing there for us to go get. Look at it. It's solid this color. But what you're doing is you are overriding and you are denying a lot of great people that want to be engaged the opportunity to get involved and make a difference. And I dare you to go back and look at the last election results of this last cycle here in Georgia. It was razor thin. So wherever we can go to try to find votes for whatever political party that you are pushing, you need to get there and get out there into those communities to make it happen. But I'm going to say this to you now. Don't drop a stranger in a rural neighborhood and expect that that person is going to connect with the people and get anything done. Your best bet is to take those funds that you are going to spend, go in there and hire that local organizer. In a place like Chattahoochee County would be somebody called Minister Linda White. People like that who knows everybody. Kevin, I know you see you over there laughing because you know what I'm talking about. Who knows everybody in that county. In a place like Wilkinson County, it would be Mary Lou Whipple, who was the first African-American female mayor of Gordon, Georgia, and the first African-American mayor of Gordon, Georgia. She's still in those small towns, those small communities. And somewhere like Twiz County, Georgia, it would be someone like Jaquez Harris, who has ascended to the chairmanship of the Board of Education in his 30s. But he knows how to turn up the vote and get them out in Twiz County, Georgia. So how do we go into these small counties and engage our rural vote? We do that by playing politics the way they know how to play politics. Don't come to Marion County or Wilcox County or Schley County or Elbert County or Lincoln County or any other county in Georgia. Don't go to these rural counties with an Atlanta blueprint. It's not going to work. There's a big difference in politics inside and outside the 285 perimeter. And when we figure that out, and when we get the people within the perimeter to realize that there are a lot of voters on the outside that can help win statewide elections, and let's work together. Let's work together to craft messaging. Let's work together to come up with our talking points, our points that we're going to fight for, things we're going to push for. You will see that tide is going to rise all boats. I promise you that, Reggie.
Well, thank you.
Going crazy over now. I'm about to praise him. He said the path to victory is. Come on.
Go ahead, Javon. Go ahead. You ain't heavy, Frank. You ain't heavy. Go ahead, Frank. I hear you.
Come on. Fred says something. I'm just saying, like, that's the biggest mistake is everybody's looking at these numbers, but they're forgetting people. You're forgetting people. Like, you're looking at a path to victory and said, okay, we got this much from this media market, this much from this county. Oh, well, there's only this amount here, and you just don't talk to them. And that's the difference. Come on, man. That's
y'all here preaching tonight. We see you. Listen, we gonna get this in a tight space because we thank everybody for coming on and watching everything. But thank y'all for this conversation. To that point, I know we got one or two folks who will have to make a pivot, but before we do, wanted to go to a lightning round for each one of you all, each one of you gentlemen, to just be able to weigh in on. And essentially, I would love for each one of you all to please provide your call to action for Black men, for the people who are on this call, for the people who have a chance to see this recording. And simply put, would you please provide your call to action by completing the following sentence? And for each of you all, please complete this sentence. When Black men vote, we can. And I want to start with Javon. Javon, when Black men vote, we can. Please complete that sentence.
When Black men vote, we can take over the world. I just honestly feel like there is so much psychologically, mentally, and socially that a Black man deals with that he never even discusses with anyone else. And part of it is us being able to have those conversations together in a way that's vulnerable, but also in a way that allows us to understand that other people are going through those same sort of straits, and then figure out how exactly we can activate those same sorts of emotions, those same sorts of efforts that we have to do to survive every single day towards a political process that, even though it wasn't made for us, we can learn to work with. And as you guys have seen, when we start to beat the game, they continue to try to change the rules. That's why I've been trying to tell people my age is that no, when we turned Georgia blue, they realized that was the case. And now they're trying to do something else to make sure it doesn't turn that way. And completely nonpartisan, by the way. I'm not saying, any of that. I got your, I got that.
Don't worry, because Fair Count is a completely nonpartisan organization who does not advocate, as we spoke about earlier, for the election, defeat, or re-election of anyone. Yes, sir.
And you know what? I'm gonna change it up. When Black men vote, they are scared. So let's keep them scared.
Gotcha. Kevin Brown, Mayor Brown, when Black men vote, we can. Please complete that sentence.
When Black men vote, we can change communities and therefore change the world. One thing about Black men is we're not looking to change it just for Black men. We changed the community for everyone. So we definitely could change the community for the better.
Thank you, sir. And Teddy, for you, sir, when Black men vote, we can.
Reggie, real quick, I just want to say thank you to the gentleman that came out here to the cigar bar to be with me here tonight. I mean, we had educators, contractors, all Black men, lawyers and doctors and people working in higher education was right here in the room together. And so we had a great group of fellas here, and I just couldn't go off without saying thank you to them for showing up and engaging in this conversation live. But when Black men vote, we ignite and we honor our ancestors' wildest dreams of seeing us inclusive in a system that wasn't designed for us, but because we learned to work within it, we are now making things happen beyond what they could have ever imagined. And if we continue to do that, we will continue to inspire generations to come of engagement, of leadership, of just taking the bull by the horns and getting done what needs to be done for our communities.
That's it. That's Teddy. You must have been a preacher in your other life. That's it. That's it. But gentlemen, seriously and honestly, thank all three of you so very much. Thank you to the gentleman, as Teddy said, who joined us this evening, certainly where you are at the cigar bar. Certainly thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon or this evening. This is our Fair Count, Black Men Count, Cigars and Civics series. And it's a part of our Fair Count Vote 365 initiative, which has been pretty much organizing, educating, and executing to make sure everyone can vote in 2022. If you have not already, please be sure to visit vote-365.org to complete one of our Commit to Vote cards and stay up to date on our upcoming events throughout the state. Tonight's conversation has definitely been informative. It's been entertaining, but more than anything else, I feel as though and hope as though people are able to leave with something from this conversation. On behalf of Fair Count, we want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And we certainly would be remiss if we did not thank both the Delta and Gamma Omicron Lambda chapters of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated for partnering with us tonight on tonight's event. We'd also like to thank, obviously, our guests, Javon Page, Mayor Kevin Brown, and we just gonna say, at least for the night, the good Reverend Teddy Reese.
Wait a minute, Reggie, one last thing.
Yes,
I was
sir.
pledged at Delta in fall 2000. I've been in Alpha 22 years. That chapter made me, and the grad chapter there helped raise me. So special shout out to the brothers down in Albany, Georgia for hosting this conversation today.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you. And thank all of you also very much for taking the time to be able to join our conversation. Thank you again to each one of our guests, our panelists, and thank all of you all for joining us. Everybody have an incredible, safe evening.